If I hadn't grabbed his hand that night, I'd probably be dead. Or worse, back in Derek's cage. It started with the kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. The moment I saw him, my ex, standing across the ballroom, a glass of champagne in his hand, and that familiar, polished smirk painted on his lips like he still owned me. I could feel my pulse trip over itself, the air thinning around me as though the chandeliers above were made of fire instead of crystal, melting my composure one drop at a time. My fingers trembled against the stem of my glass, the golden liquid inside trembling too, like it knew. Derek hadn't seen me yet. Not fully, not with that predatory focus I knew too well. But it was only a matter of seconds before his eyes locked onto mine. And when that happened, I knew he'd cross the room with that same charming smile he used to hide his cruelty, and I'd crumble. Just like before. I told myself to breathe, to stay still, to disappear. But the problem with trauma is it never listens when you tell it to behave. My body remembered everything. The way his voice could make me freeze, how his hands could bruise and caress in the same motion, how I once believed he loved me while he built a cage around my heart and called it safety. And then his gaze found me. That smirk froze for half a heartbeat. Surprise flickered, then something worse. Possession. I panicked. The crowd blurred, laughter and music melting into a low hum in my ears. I turned, scanning for an exit, but the ballroom was a labyrinth of people, glitter and glass, and he was already moving toward me. I saw the way the crowd parted around him, like they still remembered his charm, not his rot. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stepped back, bumping into someone tall, solid, unyielding. The scent hit me first, sharp, clean, dark. Something expensive and masculine, but there was an edge beneath it. Something dangerous that didn't belong to silk suits or socialites. I turned and looked up, ready to mumble an apology. But the words never made it past my lips. He was beautiful in a way that made beauty seem like an insult. Too cold, too deliberate, too powerful. His dark hair was slicked back, the kind of careless precision that whispered of control, not vanity. His jaw looked like it had been carved out of patience and violence, and his eyes... God, his eyes were winter. Pale gray, calm and endless, but with something deadly stirring deep inside. He didn't move. Didn't ask why I was trembling or why I'd turned toward him like he was salvation. He just looked at me. Not like a man looks at a woman, but like a predator studies motion in the dark, calculating whether it's prey or something else entirely. Behind me, Derek's voice sliced through the noise. Lena? And that was it. Instinct overrode reason. I reached out, grabbed the stranger's hand, and whispered the first thing that came to mind. Please, just play along. For one horrifying second, I thought he'd pull away, leave me exposed in the glare of Derek's attention. But instead, his hand closed around mine, large, steady, and terrifyingly sure. And in a single fluid movement, he pulled me closer, his arm slipping around my waist with practiced ease, his body becoming a shield between me and the man I was running from. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't need one. He leaned down, his breath grazing the shell of my ear, his voice low and rough like gravel rolling in silk. Don't look back, he said, or he'll know. Every cell in my body obeyed him. He guided me forward, out of the direct line of Derek's sight, his hand firm against the small of my back. Not possessive, but protective. Though the distinction blurred the longer I felt the heat of his body through the thin fabric of my dress. I couldn't tell if I was trembling from fear or something far more dangerous. We moved through the crowd like dancers. His confidence absolute. Mine borrowed from his. When we stopped near the edge of the ballroom, he turned me slightly so that my back rested against the marble column and his body shielded me from view. His hand still held mine, tighter now. And for the briefest moment, I let myself breathe. Then Derek's voice floated closer, all honey and venom. "Lena, sweetheart, I didn't expect to see you here." The stranger moved before I could answer. His thumb brushed my wrist, grounding me. Then he turned his head just enough for Derek to see the angle of his face. He smiled, slow, deliberate, chilling. "She's busy," he said, his tone smooth but carrying that quiet authority that made the space around him go still. Derek froze. I watched the color drain from his face, his smirk faltering, eyes flickering with recognition. Not of me, but of him. Something passed between them. Something silent, electric, laced with danger. I didn't understand it, but Derek did. Because without another word, he forced a smile, muttered an apology, and walked away. His retreat quick and graceless. I was still shaking when I looked back up at the stranger. "Thank you," I breathed, the words fragile. He said nothing, just looked at me. That same piercing calm that stripped me bare without touching me. Then, very slowly, he released my hand, his fingers trailing against mine until there was nothing left between us but air that felt charged and heavy. He leaned closer, and when he spoke, his voice slid under my skin like a promise and a threat all at once. "Next time you touch me," he said quietly, "make sure you know who I am." And then he walked away, unhurried, confident, every inch of him radiating the kind of authority that people didn't question unless they had a death wish. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart still racing, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd escaped Derek, yes. But the fear that had clutched me moments ago was shifting into something else entirely. Because people had seen. I'd seen. The way others looked at him as he passed. The way the air bent around his presence. The quiet nods of men in suits. The way no one dared to stand too close. He wasn't just anyone. I pressed a hand against my chest, trying to calm the storm inside me. His scent still lingered in the air, dark, addictive, dangerous. And somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of relief and fear, I felt it. The unmistakable pull of curiosity. That reckless hunger that had always been my undoing. Who was he? No, that wasn't the right question. The right question was, what was he? Because the way Derek had looked at him, that sudden drop of arrogance into terror, told me exactly one thing. The man whose hand I'd grabbed wasn't my savior. He was someone far more dangerous. And as I stood there, trembling and breathless under the glittering lights of a room that suddenly felt too small, I realized I hadn't escaped anything at all. I'd just stepped into something I might never escape from. I didn't sleep that night. I tried, God knows I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way he'd looked at me, unblinking and calm, as though he already knew the shape of my fear before I even spoke it. I kept replaying that moment, the press of his hand against my back, the weight of his voice in my ear telling me not to look, the deliberate way he'd stepped between me and Derek as though protecting me was instinct, not choice. I didn't even know his name, yet he lingered in my mind like smoke, something I couldn't touch but couldn't breathe without. The city outside my apartment was sleeping, but I couldn't. I sat by the window, staring out at the glittering skyline, wondering what kind of man could make Derek, a man who had destroyed people's lives for sport, back away without a word. I didn't know much about power, not the kind that didn't come with handcuffs and a court order, but I knew enough to recognize that what I'd seen in that ballroom wasn't normal. It was the kind of quiet authority that only comes from blood and fear and things whispered behind closed doors. At some point, exhaustion took me. When I woke, it was late morning, light bleeding through the curtains, and for a few blessed seconds I forgot everything. Then I saw the single black envelope lying on my kitchen counter. There was no stamp, no name, just my address, written in ink so dark it looked wet. My stomach dropped. I told myself not to open it. I told myself to throw it away, to pretend none of this had happened, to forget the stranger with the winter eyes and the voice that still clung to the edges of my thoughts. But curiosity, that stupid, self-destructive creature that always lived inside me, whispered otherwise. The paper inside was thick, expensive, faintly scented with smoke. There was only one line written in perfect, steady handwriting. Mr. Russo would like to see you. 2 p.m. The Elysian. No signature, no explanation, no question mark, because apparently this wasn't a request. I sat down, the letter trembling in my hand. The Elysian wasn't just any cafe. It was the kind of place you needed a last name and a reputation to enter. A luxury fortress for people who had both too much money and too much to hide. Mr. Russo. The name clawed at something in the back of my memory. A rumor I'd once overheard at a work event. Something about a family that owned half the city's underground. I told myself it couldn't be that. That the man from last night was probably just some rich investor with too much influence and not enough morality. But deep down, I already knew the truth. And still, I went. Because what else could I do? The kind of man who sent a message like that didn't tolerate silence. By the time I stepped out of the cab, the sky had clouded over, the city swallowed by gray. The Elysian sat at the corner of a quiet street, its glass facade gleaming like it belonged in another world, a place untouched by noise or fear. Inside, the air smelled like roasted coffee and money. Every head that turned to look at me did so discreetly, as if to measure whether I belonged there. I told the hostess I had a meeting with Mr. Russo. She nodded once, no surprise, no hesitation, and gestured for me to follow. He was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window, his jacket draped neatly over the chair beside him, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faint ink that curled around his wrist. Damien Russo. Even his name sounded like a secret you weren't supposed to say aloud. He looked up when I approached, and that single glance made my knees weaken. There was something about his stillness, about the way he filled the space without needing to move or speak. His eyes flickered over me, not cruelly, not hungrily, but in quiet assessment, as if he was cataloging every tremor, every hesitation, every lie I hadn't yet told. "You came," he said, his voice softer than I remembered, but still carrying that weight that made my heartbeat stumble. I swallowed. I didn't think I had much of a choice. His lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "You always have a choice, Lena. You just have to live with what it costs." He gestured for me to sit, and I did, though every instinct screamed to run. There was coffee already waiting for me, steaming, untouched, exactly how I would have ordered it, though I had no idea how he could have known that. "I wanted to thank you," I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. "For last night." He tilted his head slightly, eyes unreadable. "Don't thank me. You used me." The words hit like ice water. "You grabbed my hand," he continued, calm, deliberate, each word measured. "You pulled me into your little game, without knowing who I was. Do you have any idea what kind of danger that puts you in?" I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand, that I'd acted out of panic, that Derek wasn't just an ex, he was a nightmare I'd spent 2 years trying to outrun. But under that gaze, the excuses crumbled. "I was scared," I admitted, my voice cracking just enough for the truth to leak through. Something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but something dangerously close to it. "You don't have to explain fear to me," he said quietly. "But you should know this. Fear doesn't protect you. It exposes you. especially around men like me. He leaned back, his gaze dropping to the city beyond the glass, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he said, almost absently, "Your ex, Derek Winters, he won't bother you again." The words were simple, but the way he said them made the room tilt. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes met mine, steady, unflinching. "He knows who I am." A chill ran through me. "And who are you?" This time his smile did come, slow and faint, but with something sharp beneath it. "Let's just say I make problems disappear." I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But beneath the fear, something darker stirred. Curiosity, fascination, the pull of a man who wasn't afraid of anything, not even his own sins. He studied me for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You owe me," he said softly. "You used my name, my presence, my protection, even if you didn't realize what that meant. And debts, Lena, are things I always collect." I tried to steady my breath, to find some part of myself that wasn't trembling. "What do you want?" His answer was slow, deliberate, dangerous. "Your time." "My time?" "For now," he said, the corner of his mouth curving. "I want you close, until I decide otherwise." The words landed between us like a trap wrapped in silk. I knew I should refuse. I knew that men like Damien Russo didn't make offers. They made cages. But when I looked at him, I saw something behind the steel. Something I couldn't name. Something that felt like safety and danger twisted together until they were the same thing. "I don't understand," I said finally. "You don't need to," he replied, standing. "You just need to show up when I call." He reached into his jacket, placed a small black phone on the table and slid it toward me. "You'll hear from me soon." And then, without another word, he left, his reflection disappearing into the glass like smoke fading into shadow. I sat there, the phone in front of me, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I realized I'd done it again. Reached for a stranger's hand, not knowing that this time I wasn't escaping danger. I was stepping right into its arms. The screen lit up once. A message. When the clock struck 8, the next evening, I was already there. Earlier than I wanted to be. Earlier than I should have been. Sitting at a corner table in the same dimly lit cafe where the scent of roasted beans mingled with something richer and more intoxicating. The faint trace of cologne and danger that still clung to my memory like smoke. I told myself I wasn't nervous, that I was only there because I wanted to understand the man who had somehow rearranged the air in every room he entered. But the truth was heavier, darker, harder to admit. I was drawn to him, to the way his presence had pulled me out of fear and dropped me into a different kind of captivity, one made not of walls but of curiosity. The small black phone he'd given me sat on the table, dark screen reflecting the trembling light of the candles, as if waiting to be touched, to come alive. I'd thought about not coming, about turning it off, about pretending that night in the ballroom had never happened. But something inside me, something wild and unhealed, whispered that I couldn't run from him. Not really, because he wasn't the kind of man you escaped. He was the kind of man who found you even when you hid in plain sight. When the door opened, I didn't need to look up to know it was him. The atmosphere changed, subtle but absolute. A shift in gravity that made people sit straighter, that made the air grow still, like everyone in the room had unconsciously agreed that something more important than them had just walked in. He wasn't wearing a tie tonight, just a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up again, exposing strong forearms and a silver watch that caught the light like a blade. His hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd run a hand through it out of habit rather than vanity. And his eyes, those impossible gray eyes, found mine instantly, unhurried, assured, devastatingly calm. "Lena," he said as he approached, my name sounding different when it came from his mouth, heavier, like it belonged to him for the duration of the word. Mr. Russo, I replied, my voice softer than I intended, my heartbeat loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it. He sat across from me, resting his hands on the table, the faintest hint of a smile playing at his lips. You came. I wasn't sure I had a choice, I said, though the words lacked conviction. There's always a choice, he murmured, that same refrain from before, as if he enjoyed watching me struggle to understand what it meant. But you made the right one. He signaled the waiter with nothing but a glance. 2 espressos appeared minutes later, the staff moving around him with quiet precision, like planets orbiting a fixed and dangerous sun. We sat in silence for a moment, the low hum of the cafe filling the space between us, though it felt more like a heartbeat than background noise. He spoke first. Tell me about him. Derek. The name hit me like a slap, but I forced myself not to flinch. Why? Because I need to know what kind of man thought he could touch what's mine. The words caught me off guard. The claim, the possessiveness threaded through his tone, the way it wasn't even a question but a statement delivered with quiet authority. I'm not yours, I said, but it came out weaker than I wanted. He smiled faintly, leaning forward, elbows on the table, his gaze so steady it felt like it could strip me down to my thoughts. Not yet. There was a pulse in the air. Hot, dangerous, alive. And for a second I couldn't tell whether I wanted to flee or fall deeper into it. I exhaled slowly. Derek was charming, at first. He said all the right things, made me feel like I was the only person in the world who saw him clearly. But charm is a lie men like him tell to make you forget what they're capable of. It starts with small things. Who you talk to, where you go, what you wear. Until one day you wake up and realize you've built your life out of apologies. Damien didn't interrupt. He didn't pity. He just listened, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though committing every word to memory. He didn't stop when I left, I continued, my voice faltering. He made sure I knew he could find me no matter where I went. And last night, when I saw him there, smiling like he'd never broken a single thing in his life, I paused, swallowing the tremor in my throat. I panicked. You survived, he said simply, as though it were the only part that mattered. I met his eyes. Because of you. He tilted his head slightly, something unreadable flickering behind his expression. Do you know who I am yet, Lena? I think so, I whispered. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low and measured. Say it. You're involved in things, I began cautiously. Dangerous things. He laughed, quiet, humorless, the sound of someone who's heard the same truth too many times to care. That's one way to put it. He stirred his espresso, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. What you need to understand is that when you took my hand that night, you stepped into my world, and my world doesn't let go easily. I should have felt afraid, and I did. But fear has layers, and beneath it was something far more confusing. The awareness that a part of me didn't want to let go, that maybe I was tired of pretending safety was the same thing as freedom. Why me? I asked finally. You could have walked away, you could have ignored me, but you didn't. Why? He studied me for a long time before answering. Because you didn't flinch when you grabbed me. You didn't know who I was, yet you reached for me like you already trusted I'd keep you alive. People like me don't get that kind of faith often. The words lodged somewhere deep, somewhere I didn't know existed. That wasn't faith, I said softly. It was desperation. Maybe, he said, his tone softening. But desperation is honest. It doesn't lie, it doesn't pretend. It just reaches out and hopes someone will catch it. For a moment, silence hung heavy between us. Then his phone buzzed once on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting, tightening. Without apology, he stood. I have to go, he said, reaching for his jacket. "That's it?" I asked, more sharply than I intended. "For now." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed a small silver key on the table between us. "If anyone follows you, or if your ex tries to contact you again, go to this address." He slid a card toward me. "Tell them I sent you. They'll know what to do." I stared at the key, the card, then back at him. "What are you expecting me to get involved in?" His eyes softened. Not kindness, but something close to it. An echo of it. "You already are." He turned to leave, and I should have let him go. Should have kept my distance. Should have protected whatever was left of the life I'd managed to rebuild. But the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Damien." He paused at the door, looking back. "What are you going to do about Derek?" He smiled, slow, dangerous, deliberate. "You'll find out soon enough." And then he was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving behind the faintest trace of his cologne and the taste of something bitter and inevitable in the air. I sat there long after he left, staring at the key glinting under the candlelight, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion pressing down on my chest. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, low and deep, the kind that promised a storm. And for the first time I understood. Damien Rousseau wasn't a man you met by accident. He was a consequence. I didn't see him for 3 days, though he never really left my mind. Or maybe he never meant to. Damien Rousseau had a way of lingering even in silence, like smoke trapped in fabric, faint but impossible to wash away. Every time my phone lit up, even for something as mundane as a spam message or a weather alert, my pulse stuttered, waiting for his name. Though I wasn't sure if I wanted to see it, or if I was terrified that I would. The key he'd left sat on my kitchen counter beside a half-drunk cup of coffee and an unopened letter from my landlord, and every time I looked at it, I felt that same strange combination of fear and fascination, the kind that makes you lean closer to the fire even though you know it will burn you. I'd told myself it was only for protection, that he'd given it to me out of caution, not possession. But deep down, I knew that nothing Damien Rousseau did was without intent. He didn't offer safety. He offered ownership disguised as it. On the third night, as rain streaked the windows in silver threads, and the city outside breathed its usual restless rhythm, the phone he'd given me finally lit up. "Unknown. Come to the address on the card. Now." No greeting, no explanation, no question mark. Just command, written with the kind of certainty that didn't need justification. I stared at the message for a long time, fingers trembling around the device, wondering if obedience made me weak, or if defiance would make me stupid. And then, almost against my will, I found myself pulling on a coat and walking into the rain. The address led me to a part of the city I'd only ever heard about. The kind of place that existed in half-whispered stories and late-night news reports, where power didn't wear suits or smiles. The building was an old brownstone, tall and silent, its facade unremarkable except for the 2 men standing outside under the awning, dressed in black, and watching the street with the kind of stillness that suggested they were more accustomed to violence than conversation. When I approached, one of them nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Moretti?" I hesitated before answering, but my voice betrayed me. "Yes." He opened the door without another word, and I stepped inside. The interior was nothing like I expected. Not cold or sterile, but warm in a way that felt curated, deliberate. Low lighting, dark wood, soft jazz playing from somewhere unseen. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress disguised as elegance. And in the center of it, standing beside a glass of whiskey and a stack of papers he wasn't reading, was Damien. He didn't turn immediately, just spoke over his shoulder, voice smooth as ever. "You took your time." "I wasn't sure if I should come," I said, though even as I said it, I knew how useless it sounded. He turned then, eyes finding mine with that same unnerving precision. And for a moment, the world outside disappeared. The rain, the fear, the distance I'd promised myself to keep. And yet here you are. I wanted to deny it, to tell him that I came because I didn't have a choice, that his text wasn't an invitation but an order. But the lie caught in my throat. The truth was simpler, darker. I wanted to see him. I wanted to understand what it was about him that had unraveled me in a single night. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice low, uncertain. He gestured around, casual but deliberate. A safe house, one of several. For me. For now, he said, and something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not fear exactly, but that strange, electric awareness that always accompanied him. He crossed the room slowly, the faint sound of his footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet, and stopped close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "I've made some arrangements," he said, his gaze holding mine. "Your ex won't touch you again, but that means I've painted a target where there wasn't one before. You understand what that means, don't you?" I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. "That I'm in danger." He nodded once. "Yes, but you're also under my protection now, and that comes with certain expectations." "Expectations?" He leaned closer, his breath ghosting against my cheek. "I expect you to listen, to trust me, to stay where I can see you. The men who want to hurt me will use anything they can find. And right now that's you." I should have been furious at the implication, at the way his words blurred the line between protection and possession. But instead I felt something far more dangerous. A slow, undeniable pull. A part of me that wanted to be near him, even as every rational thought screamed that I shouldn't. "Why me?" I asked again, the question that had been burning since the moment we met. "You could have ignored me that night. You didn't owe me anything." He studied me, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't." The silence that followed was thick, pulsing, alive. I could hear the rain against the windows, the slow ticking of a clock somewhere in the corner, the faint hum of my own heartbeat. He reached out suddenly, his fingers brushing a strand of wet hair from my face, the touch so gentle it startled me. "You don't belong in this world, Lena," he said softly. "But now that you're in it, I can't let you go wandering off pretending you do." There was no threat in his tone, no cruelty, just quiet certainty. And that made it worse because it meant he believed every word he said. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze even though it made my chest ache. "And if I say no? If I walk away?" He smiled then, slow and devastating. "Then you'll have to hope your ex is the only one looking for you." The room seemed to shrink around us. I could smell him, whiskey, leather, rain, the scent of sin wrapped in sophistication. My breath hitched, and he noticed, because of course he did. He always noticed. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, voice lowering. "I'm asking you to survive." The words settled deep in my bones. I didn't realize how close we were until I felt the faintest brush of his hand against my waist, not demanding, not even possessive, just there. Like gravity itself had made the choice for me. I didn't move. Neither did he. "I don't know what you want from me," I whispered. He tilted his head slightly, eyes tracing the outline of my face with that same relentless focus. "I don't either," he said after a long moment. "And that's what makes it dangerous." I should have stepped back then, broken whatever spell had settled between us, but I didn't. Because in that moment, standing inches from a man whose name could start wars, I felt more alive than I had in years. He finally let go, stepping back with a sigh that sounded almost reluctant. "You'll stay here tonight. There's a room upstairs. Clean clothes, food, whatever you need. Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." "Do I get a choice in that?" His lips curved, not quite a smile. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already make one. He turned away before I could answer, picking up his glass of whiskey, his reflection flickering in the window against the storm. I stood there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, realizing that I wasn't sure whether I'd just been offered protection or a prison. As I climbed the stairs, my fingers brushing against the railing, polished smooth from years of secrets, I heard his voice again, low, almost to himself. She doesn't know yet, he murmured, but she will. I didn't ask what he meant, because somewhere deep down, I already knew. I woke before dawn to the sound of voices, low, tense, and sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of the rain outside. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was too beautiful to be mine, too still to belong to anyone who slept peacefully. The air smelled faintly of smoke and expensive whiskey, and the silk sheets beneath my fingers were cool, smooth, impersonal. Then it all came rushing back. The key, the message, Damien's eyes holding mine like a promise and a threat all at once. And the realization settled heavy in my chest. I was inside his world now, and no amount of pretending could change that. I slipped out of bed and moved to the door, drawn by the sound of the men below. Their voices came from the study, deep, deliberate, the kind of tones that spoke in decisions, not words. I couldn't make out everything, but one voice, low and controlled, cut through the others like a blade through glass. Damien. No one touches her, he said, not unless I say so. There was a pause, then another voice, rougher, older. She's a liability, Russo, you know that. She's mine, Damien answered, quiet but final, and I felt something twist in my chest. Not anger, not quite fear, something far more dangerous, something that felt like recognition. I knew I shouldn't be listening, knew that if he found me he'd see the fear in my eyes and the betrayal in my silence. But curiosity and survival are cousins, and both of them were whispering that I needed to understand the man I'd tied my safety to. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Chairs scraping, footsteps retreating, a door closing somewhere in the distance. I waited until I was sure the room below was empty before I slipped down the staircase, careful not to let the old wood creak beneath my bare feet. The study door was half open. I shouldn't have looked inside, but I did, and what I saw made my breath catch. Damien stood by the window, back turned, phone pressed to his ear, the gray light of early morning washing over him. His jacket was off, his shirt sleeves rolled high, and there were faint streaks of crimson across his hands. Not fresh, not enough to be alarming, but enough to make me wonder what kind of night he'd had. I told you to keep it clean, he said into the phone, voice calm, almost too calm, the kind of tone that hides storms. I don't care what it costs. Make sure there's no trace left behind. He hung up, exhaling slowly, and that was when he noticed me. His eyes lifted, gray and sharp, and the air between us thickened with the weight of everything unspoken. You shouldn't be up, he said, not unkindly, but with that same quiet authority that made it sound less like concern and more like an order. I heard voices, I said, forcing steadiness into my tone that I didn't feel. I didn't mean to. You were listening. It wasn't a question, and I didn't bother to deny it. Who were you talking to? He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the window. Someone who needed reminding where his loyalty lies. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my throat. You hurt someone. He didn't turn. Sometimes hurt is the only language people understand. The honesty in his voice made my skin prickle. And what about me? I asked softly. What language do you plan to use with me? This time he did look at me, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw something human flicker behind the ice. Something weary, maybe even regretful. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. That depends on whether you keep listening at doors, he said, and though his words carried a shadow of amusement, his eyes told a different story, one of warning, and something else I couldn't name. I crossed my arms, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. You talk about protection like it's a favor, but I didn't ask for this. You pulled me into something I don't understand, and now you expect me to act like it's normal. He moved toward me then, slow, deliberate, until the distance between us disappeared and I could feel the heat radiating off his body, smell the faint metallic trace of blood beneath his cologne. You think I wanted this? He said, his voice low. You think I plan to have you standing here, looking at me like you're trying to decide whether to run or to reach for me? I swallowed hard, unable to look away. You didn't have to save me that night. He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. No, he said, but I did. And now here we are. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile, until I realized he was still bleeding, just a thin line along his wrist, hidden beneath the rolled cuff of his shirt. Without thinking, I reached out, catching his hand before he could pull away. The cut wasn't deep, just enough to sting, and I could see the faint tremor in his fingers, the human detail beneath all the control. You should clean this, I murmured, my thumb brushing against his skin before I could stop myself. He looked down at our joined hands, then up at me, and something shifted in his expression, something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. You shouldn't touch me, he said, but his voice was softer now, almost hoarse. Why? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because I don't know what I'll do if you don't stop. The words hung between us like smoke, and for a second I forgot to breathe. I should have pulled away, should have remembered every reason this man was a storm I couldn't survive, but instead I stayed still, caught in the quiet gravity of him. When he finally stepped back, it wasn't out of rejection but restraint, the kind that costs more than surrender. Go upstairs, he said, his tone measured again, the mask sliding back into place. Get some rest. We leave in an hour. Leave? He nodded once. It's not safe here anymore. Someone's talking and I intend to find out who. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. And what happens when you do? He smiled then, a small, cold thing that didn't reach his eyes. Then there will be one less traitor in the world. There was no point in arguing. I turned to go, but before I reached the door, he spoke again, softer this time. Lena. I stopped, looking back. I wasn't lying when I said I'd keep you safe, he said. But safety looks different in my world. Sometimes it bleeds. I didn't respond, couldn't, because the truth in his words was already sinking in. Slow, heavy, inevitable. An hour later, we were in his car, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and gold. He didn't speak, and neither did I, but the silence between us was full, of questions, of things neither of us dared to name. I watched his hands on the wheel, steady, elegant, dangerous, and I thought about what the man beside me truly was. Not a savior, not a villain, something in between. Something that didn't exist in the ordinary world, because he didn't belong to it. And now, by extension, neither did I. As we crossed the bridge out of the city, the sky split open with the sound of sirens in the distance, and Damien's phone buzzed once against the console. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening, and then he cursed under his breath. Quiet. Vicious. Final. What is it? I asked. He looked at me, eyes dark and cold as steel. Your ex, he said. He's not running anymore. He's fighting back. And in that moment, as the rain turned to a downpour and the skyline vanished behind us, I understood that whatever fragile sense of safety I'd clung to was gone. The war had started, and I was already standing on the wrong side of it. The storm followed us out of the city like a shadow refusing to let go, its rain carving streaks down the windows, as if the sky itself were mourning something it couldn't name. And as I sat beside Damien in that silent car, watching the road stretch endlessly ahead, I couldn't help but wonder if I had crossed some invisible line between what I thought I understood and the kind of truth that changes you forever. The city lights faded behind us, until all that was left were the occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated his face in harsh, silver fragments. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that looked too calm for a man driving straight into danger, and a jaw set with a quiet determination that felt less like confidence and more like inevitability. I wanted to ask where we were going, what he planned to do, how my ex, the man I once thought could destroy me, had suddenly become just another name in the long, dark list of enemies Damien seemed to keep. But I didn't ask. Because I'd learned that with him, silence was safer than questions, that answers were weapons in disguise, and if he wanted me to know, he would tell me, or show me, which, with Damien, was infinitely worse. We drove for over an hour before the car turned down a narrow road lined with pines, their branches bending under the weight of the rain. The headlights cut through the mist, revealing the outline of a mansion, not as grand as his city estate, but older, heavier, the kind of place that didn't welcome visitors. When we stopped, he got out first, rounding the car before I even reached for the handle. He opened my door without a word, offering his hand, and for a brief, traitorous moment, I hesitated, because every time I took it, something inside me seemed to shift, something I couldn't control or name, something that made me feel both safe and suffocated. But the rain was relentless, and his hand was steady, so I let him lead me inside. The interior smelled like leather and smoke and rain-soaked wood, a scent that somehow fit him perfectly, expensive but edged with something primal. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls, and I noticed the faint hum of voices coming from deeper inside, the kind of murmuring that stopped when the person in charge entered the room. Damien removed his coat, handed it to one of his men, and nodded for me to follow. "Stay close," he said quietly, though his tone wasn't one of command this time, but of warning, as if he knew that proximity was its own form of protection here. We entered what looked like a war room, not in the literal sense, though it might as well have been. A long table stretched across the center, scattered with maps, documents, photographs, and a few weapons that no one bothered to hide. Men stood around it, their suits immaculate but their eyes hard, like they'd forgotten how to be human somewhere along the way. Every head turned when Damien walked in, and the shift in the air was immediate, a mix of respect and fear that clung to him like armor. One man, older, with scars tracing the lines of his knuckles, stepped forward. "We found them," he said. "3 of Winter's men hiding in the docks. They talked." Damien's jaw tightened. "And?" "They said he's aligning with the Valentis, promised them territory in exchange for protection." A muscle in Damien's cheek twitched, a sign I'd come to recognize as anger restrained. "The Valentis don't protect," he said evenly. "They consume." The man nodded. "Then I suppose he's already half-eaten?" Damien's eyes flicked to me briefly, as if to remind himself I was there, as if to gauge how much of this I could handle. I didn't flinch. I'd already learned that pretending not to be afraid was sometimes the only power left to claim. He turned back to the others. "Make it clear to the Valentis that Derek Winters is not theirs to bargain with. He belongs to me." The words made my heart stutter. Belongs. It wasn't just vengeance. It was possession. I could feel it in the way he said it, the weight behind every syllable, the dark promise that came with being the target of his wrath. The meeting ended quickly after that. Orders were given, phones buzzed, men left in silence. When the room finally emptied, I stayed where I was, my hands clenched at my sides, trying to ignore the way my pulse refused to slow. Damien stood at the head of the table, staring down at a photograph I couldn't see. "You think I'm a monster," he said without looking up. I hesitated. "I think you do monstrous things for reasons I don't understand." He finally looked at me, and his eyes, those impossible eyes, were stripped of their usual composure. "That's closer to the truth than you realize." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "You want to know why I didn't walk away that night? Why I let you pull me into your chaos?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten existed," he said, his tone softer now, almost fragile. "Fear without greed. Innocence that isn't ignorance. When you grabbed my hand, I saw something I haven't seen in years. Someone who still believed a stranger could save her." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't innocent, that my fear was born from choices and not purity, that whatever he saw in me was already gone. But when I opened my mouth, the words tangled in my throat, and instead I whispered, "And what did you do with that memory, Damien?" He smiled, but it wasn't kind. "I tried to protect it," he said, "but my world doesn't allow beautiful things to survive for long." The air between us thickened again, and I could feel the storm outside pressing against the windows, matching the one inside my chest. "What are you going to do about Derek?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "What I should have done the moment he looked at you that night," he said simply. "End it." Something inside me broke at the finality of his tone. Not because Derek deserved mercy, but because the man standing in front of me, the one I was beginning to understand too well, didn't seem to have any left to give. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "And when it's over? What happens then? To me?" His gaze softened. Not much, just enough to let me glimpse the truth beneath the steel. "Then you decide whether you want to keep pretending you're not part of this anymore." He turned away, walking toward the door, but before he reached it, I spoke again, my voice trembling. "You make it sound like I have a choice." He stopped, half-turned, the faintest flicker of something, regret, maybe, or desire, crossing his face. "You always do, Lena," he said quietly. "You just might not like what it costs." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a room full of ghosts and rain, and the echo of a man who made promises with blood instead of words. I walked to the table, my eyes catching on the edge of a photograph he'd left behind. It was Derek, alive, smiling, standing beside two unfamiliar men in suits. The image was recent. The date scrawled at the bottom made my stomach turn. 2 days ago. He wasn't just fighting back, he was planning something, and if Damien didn't kill him first, I had no doubt Derek would try to finish what he started. But what terrified me most wasn't that both men were circling each other in a war of power and pride. It was that I no longer knew which side of that war my heart wanted to survive. I barely slept that night. Sleep, I realized, was a luxury for people whose hearts weren't divided between dread and desire. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Damien. The way he stood in the storm-lit room, every inch of him shaped by purpose and restraint. A man made of fire pretending to be ice. His words lingered like the echo of a gunshot. "You always have a choice, you just might not like what it costs." What he didn't say, what I was starting to understand on my own, was that he wasn't just talking about me choosing him, or choosing safety. He was talking about the quiet war that lived inside both of us, a war made of contradictions, need and guilt, control and surrender, fear and something that felt too much like love to call by its real name. When dawn finally crept through the curtains, the house was still. The rain gone, but replaced by a strange kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. I wandered downstairs, barefoot, drawn to the smell of coffee and the low hum of a radio murmuring in Italian. Damien was already awake, Of course he was, leaning against the counter in the kitchen, a gun on the table beside his coffee cup as casually as someone else might leave their keys. He looked up when I entered, his gaze softening for the briefest moment before settling back into that impenetrable calm he wore like armor. "Morning," he said, voice rough, quiet, as though the word itself were private. "Morning," I echoed, my throat dry. He gestured toward the mug across from him. "Drink." It wasn't quite an order, but it wasn't an offer, either. Still, I sat, my hands curling around the warm porcelain, grateful for something tangible to hold on to. The silence between us stretched, thick and strange, filled with things neither of us wanted to say out loud. Finally, he broke it. "The Valentis made their move last night," he said, his tone calm but his jaw tight. "One of my warehouses was hit, 3 men dead." I looked up sharply. "Was Derek there?" "No," he said, meeting my eyes. "But his fingerprints are all over it." The words sent a chill through me, though not for the reason they should have. It wasn't just the violence. It was the way Damien said it. Like death had become a familiar language, like loss was something he'd stopped translating into grief long ago. "What happens now?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Now," he said, pushing away from the counter. "We send a message." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Because part of me didn't want to know. Didn't want to hear what vengeance sounded like when spoken by a man who made it look like art. He walked toward me then, and I could feel the shift in the air. That slow, electric current that always seemed to follow him, the kind that made it hard to breathe and even harder to look away. "You shouldn't be here when it happens," he said quietly. "It's not safe." I almost laughed, though there was nothing funny about any of it. "You've been saying that since the moment we met, Damien. And yet I'm still here." He tilted his head, a flicker of something dangerous and tender passing behind his eyes. "That's what scares me," he said softly. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't scared, that the only thing that frightened me now was how much I'd stopped wanting to run. But before I could answer, one of his men burst through the door. Breathless, pale, eyes wide with the kind of urgency that doesn't come without blood behind it. "Boss?" he said, voice shaking. "The perimeter's been breached." Time fractured. Damien moved instantly. No hesitation, no fear, just precision. Like his body had already mapped the next 10 steps before his mind caught up. He grabbed the gun off the counter, checked the magazine, then turned to me, eyes hard now, all softness erased. "Upstairs," he ordered. "Now." I didn't move. "Damien, go." There was no room for argument in that word, no space for reason or rebellion, only command. I started toward the staircase, but the sound that followed froze me. The sharp, deafening crack of gunfire outside. Close, too close. Damien swore under his breath, moving toward the window, his movements fluid, controlled, terrifyingly calm. I caught a glimpse of black vehicles beyond the gates, shadows moving fast between flashes of sunlight. The Valentis. And then the front doors exploded inward. I didn't see much, just chaos, shouts, the smell of gunpowder, the splintering of wood, and glass. One of Damien's men fell near the entryway, and I heard Damien shout something in Italian before he fired, the sound so loud it felt like it split the air in half. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood there frozen, heart hammering, ears ringing, until a hand grabbed my arm. Not his, someone else's. And I screamed, instinct taking over as I fought against the grip. Then another shot, closer this time, and the body that held me went limp. Damien was there a second later, his arm locking around me, dragging me backward toward the stairs. "Move," he said, voice low but urgent, his breath hot against my ear. Don't stop, no matter what you hear." We ran, footsteps pounding against the marble, smoke filling the air like fog from hell. Behind us, the sounds of the fight blurred into a symphony of destruction. Shouts, gunfire, breaking glass, until it was impossible to tell who was winning, only that people were dying. He pushed me into a small room at the end of the hall, locking the door behind us. The world outside kept shaking. "Stay down," he said, crouching beside me, reloading his gun. There was blood on his shoulder. I didn't know whose, didn't ask. And when he looked at me, his expression cracked for the first time since I'd met him. "You shouldn't have been here," he said, voice rough, breath unsteady. "I told you," I whispered, my own voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." For a second, the chaos outside faded, replaced by something deeper, quieter, more dangerous. He reached for me, his hand trembling as it brushed the side of my face, tracing the line of my jaw like he was memorizing it, like it might be the last time. "Lena," he said, my name a confession on his tongue. "If we make it out of this, you run. Do you understand me? You take the car, you disappear." I shook my head, tears burning hot. "No." "Yes," he said, sharper now, though his eyes betrayed him. "You don't belong in this world." The sound of footsteps outside the door cut through the moment like a knife. He moved in front of me, gun raised, every muscle coiled. The doorknob turned once, twice, and then the wood splintered as someone kicked it open. The next few seconds were a blur of light and noise. Damien fired, the intruder fell, and for a heartbeat I thought it was over. But then there was another sound. A different gun from behind, from the hallway. And Damien's body jerked, his breath catching. I screamed, grabbing him as he stumbled backward, his blood hot and slick against my hands. He looked at me, eyes wide but steady, voice low and shaking as he whispered, "Get out!" I shook my head again, panic swallowing me whole. "I'm not—" "Go," he said, blood at the corner of his mouth, a small broken smile ghosting over his lips. "This is the price of safety, Lena." And then another explosion shook the house, the ceiling cracking above, us, and the world dissolved into chaos once more. I didn't know what was waiting beyond that door, death, freedom, or both, but I knew one thing for certain. Safety was never free, and Damien Russo had just paid for mine in blood. When I opened my eyes, the world was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from aftermath. Heavy, suffocating, like the earth itself was holding its breath. My ears still rang with echoes of gunfire. My body ached from where I'd hit the floor, and for one suspended second I couldn't remember where I was or why the air smelled like smoke and metal and fear. Then memory struck, sharp as glass. Damien's voice, the explosion, the weight of his blood on my hands, and the silence turned cruel. The room was half collapsed, the walls cracked and dust falling in lazy spirals from the ceiling. I coughed, dragging myself upright, my head spinning, my vision swimming in fragments of light and shadow. The door was gone, blown off its hinges, and through the haze I saw the hall beyond. Splintered furniture, bullet holes, bodies that used to be men. But not his. "Damien," I whispered, my voice breaking on the name like it didn't belong to me anymore. No answer. Only the sound of rain leaking through the shattered windows, faint and merciless. I stumbled to my feet, every muscle screaming, my mind clinging to the hope that maybe he'd made it out. Maybe he'd done what he always did. Survive. He couldn't be dead. Men like Damien Russo didn't die in ordinary ways. They didn't bleed out quietly on cold marble floors. They burned. They raged. They defied death until it grew tired of chasing them. But the blood on my skin was still warm. I moved through the wreckage, calling his name again, louder this time, the echo of it bouncing back like mockery. I found 2 of his men near the staircase, both gone, their eyes open and glassy, their weapons still clenched in their hands. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Because this, all of this, was what his world truly looked like when the masks fell away. It wasn't power. It wasn't control. It was ruin. Something shifted in the corner of my vision. A shadow, a flicker of movement. And before I could react, a hand grabbed my arm from behind. I screamed, twisting free until the face came into focus. Luca, one of Damien's most trusted men, his dark suit torn, his temple bleeding. "Jesus, Lena," he breathed, his voice hoarse, his hand gripping my shoulder. "You're alive." "Where's Damien?" I demanded, clutching his arm. "Tell me he's alive." Luca's eyes flickered, and the pause that followed told me everything before he even spoke. "He took a bullet," he said quietly. "It hit him in the shoulder. But there was too much fire. Too many of them. We tried to get him out, but—" "But what?" I interrupted, my voice rising, desperation clawing its way through my chest. "They took him," Luca said finally, the words like a death sentence. "The Valentis. They dragged him out before we could reach him." For a moment the world tilted, the air vanishing from my lungs. Took him. Not dead. Not gone. Taken. A flicker of hope, fragile, reckless, sparked in the middle of the devastation. "Where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The docks," Luca said. "Their territory. But you can't go there, Lena. If they see you—" "I don't care," I said, my voice shaking but certain. "I'm not leaving him." He tried to protest, but I was already moving, stumbling toward the door, my mind a blur of memory and madness. The first time I'd seen Damien, the feel of his hand on my back, the sound of his voice when he told me not to look. He'd saved me from one monster only to become another, and still, I couldn't let him die. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the world look unreal. Luca followed close behind, muttering curses under his breath, his gun drawn as we moved through the trees toward the car. The night felt endless. The roads slick beneath the tires as we drove toward the docks, the city reappearing in glimpses through the fog. Its lights cold, indifferent, distant. "Why are you doing this?" Luca asked suddenly, his tone somewhere between disbelief and pity. "He wouldn't want you anywhere near this." I stared out the window, watching the blur of neon and darkness. "You don't understand," I said quietly. "He saved me. He became the danger so I wouldn't have to keep running from it. I can't just walk away now." Luca exhaled, shaking his head. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." "Maybe both," I said, and the truth of it made me almost smile. When we reached the docks, the air was heavy with salt and oil, the water black and restless beneath the pale moon. Crates were scattered like bones, and the flicker of distant lights marked the outline of a warehouse at the far end of the pier. The Valentis' men were there, shadows moving between shadows, guns gleaming faintly when they caught the light. We parked far enough away to stay unseen. Luca loaded his weapon, checked it once, then looked at me. "You stay here, I mean it." I didn't answer. He cursed under his breath and slipped into the dark, disappearing toward the warehouse. I waited for exactly 30 seconds before following. The closer I got, the more I could hear. Voices, low and sharp, laughter that made my skin crawl. I crept around the side of the building, keeping to the shadows, until I found a gap in the metal wall where a section had been blown open. Through it, I saw Damien. He was on his knees, hands bound, blood seeping through the torn fabric of his shirt. His head was bowed, but even broken, even bleeding, he looked untouchable. The kind of man who could turn pain into something, regale. A man like that doesn't beg. He endures. One of the Valentis, a tall man with slick hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, circled him slowly, speaking in Italian, words I couldn't understand, but tones I didn't need translated. Damien looked up once, meeting his gaze, and even from a distance I could feel the force of it, the defiance that burned brighter than fear. Then the man struck him, hard, the sound echoing like thunder against metal. I bit my hand to keep from screaming. Luca's silhouette appeared behind the crates, gun raised, motioning for me to stay down. But I couldn't. Every instinct I had, the ones that used to belong to survival, betrayed me. I stepped forward, my breath trembling, my voice a whisper lost to the rain. "Damien." And somehow, impossibly, he heard me. His head turned, eyes finding mine through the slit in the wall, gray and wild and alive. For a heartbeat, everything else fell away, the men, the guns, the war, until there was only us, bound by something that shouldn't have existed, something that neither of us could destroy. He shook his head, just once, subtle, a warning, a plea. Go. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment shattered when one of the Valentis noticed the movement, his shout cutting through the night. Gunfire erupted again, sharp, merciless, and all I could do was duck as bullets tore through the walls around me. Luca shouted my name somewhere behind me, his voice swallowed by the chaos. When I looked back through the gap, Damien was gone. They were dragging him toward a waiting car, his body limp but not lifeless, his eyes still open. And before the door slammed shut, before the engine roared to life, he looked at me one last time, not in fear, not in pain, but in warning. Then they disappeared into the night. I stood there in the rain, shaking, my hands still covered in dust and blood that wasn't mine. And for the first time, I realized the truth that had been building all along. This wasn't just his war anymore. It was mine too. The days that followed blurred into one another, a disjointed sequence of sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the hollow ache of a heart that refused to believe what it had seen. I kept seeing him, Damien on his knees, blood dripping down his arm like a confession, eyes locked on mine as if he were trying to memorize my face before vanishing into the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived that moment, the helplessness, the terror, the rage that pulsed so deep inside me it felt like another heartbeat. I had been many things in my life, naive, frightened, broken, but never furious. Not like this. Not with a fury that made my hands shake and my breath come in sharp, uneven bursts, the kind of fury that demanded something, anything, to be done. I didn't care about consequences anymore, didn't care about fear or logic or the invisible line I'd crossed the moment I stepped into Damien, Rousseau's orbit. All I cared about was that he was out there somewhere, hurt, alone, maybe dying, and that the world, his world, was silent without him. Luca tried to keep me inside the safe house, barricading the windows, locking the doors, speaking to the others in low voices that stopped whenever I entered the room. He treated me like something fragile, something valuable but breakable, and I hated it. Because the truth was I was already broken, and I didn't need saving. I needed to save him. "You don't understand," I told him one night, slamming my hand on the table hard enough to make the glass shake. "They'll kill him if we wait. Every second we waste is another wound, another chance they get to destroy him." Luca exhaled, weary and hard. "You think I don't care? You think I don't want to go after him? He's my family, Lena, but running in blind will get us all killed. We don't even know where they've taken him." "Yes, we do," I said, my voice sharp, the anger spilling over. "The docks were just the start. The Valentis have a holding site." I heard them say it. A place near the river where they keep people until they decide what to do with them. He frowned. "You heard them?" I hesitated, realizing too late that I'd revealed how closely I'd followed that night, how I'd ignored his orders. I heard enough, I said finally. He studied me for a long time, jaw tightening. You shouldn't have been there. Maybe not, I snapped, but if I hadn't been, you'd still be sitting here pretending he's already dead. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was decision. By morning, the plan was set, if it could even be called a plan. 2 cars, 4 men and me, against a network of enemies that had made a career out of bleeding empires dry. I wasn't supposed to go, but there was no force on earth that could have kept me away. The drive to the river was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes before violence. The city looked different at dawn. Stripped bare by fog, its skyscrapers ghostly outlines of power and promise. I watched them fade in the rearview mirror, my reflection fractured by the glass, my eyes unfamiliar. Harder, colder, belonging to someone I didn't recognize. Luca drove ahead, his men silent, their weapons heavy in their hands. I thought about what Damien would say if he saw me now. If he'd be furious or proud, if he'd tell me I was brave or stupid, if he'd even believe I was capable of this. But I didn't need his approval anymore. I just needed him alive. When we reached the riverfront, the world had turned gray and still. The warehouse stood at the edge of the water, its metal siding rusted and streaked, its windows blacked out. There were guards, too many, but Luca's men moved like shadows, taking them out one by one, quiet, efficient, deadly. I followed, my heartbeat loud in my ears, my every step trembling, but sure. The first gunshot came from inside, then another. Then all at once, chaos erupted, the kind of chaos Damien had warned me about, the kind that had a pulse of its own, fast and merciless. I stayed low, clutching the gun Luca had forced into my hand hours earlier, the metal cold against my skin. I didn't fire, not yet, but I could smell the cordite, could feel the vibration of each bullet through the floor. And then, in the middle of it all, I heard his voice. Lena. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even a shout, but it was his. I turned toward the sound, heart in my throat, and saw him. Bruised, bloodied, half collapsed but still alive, tied to a chair at the far end of the room. His head lifted when he saw me, disbelief flashing through his eyes, quickly followed by anger. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded, his voice raw, furious, terrified. I moved toward him, ducking behind a crate as bullets tore through the air. Saving you, I shouted back. He gave a hoarse, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. You shouldn't have come. Neither should you have stayed, I said, my voice breaking, the words tumbling out between breaths. But here we are. Luca's men covered me as I ran the last few feet, cutting through the ropes around Damien's wrists. His skin was slick with blood, but his grip was still strong when his hand caught mine. The moment our fingers met, something inside me snapped. The fear, the anger, the distance. All of it burned away in the heat of survival. We moved as one, his arm around my waist, mine around his shoulders, dragging each other toward the exit. Gunfire followed us, the sound deafening, the air thick with smoke. I didn't know which of us was bleeding more, didn't care. We just kept moving. Outside, the world was a blur of rain and shouting. A car screeched into view, Luca behind the wheel, and we barely made it inside before another explosion ripped through the warehouse, sending fire spilling into the sky like a second sunrise. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. The roar of the engine, the ragged gasps of 2 people who had no business being alive. Damien leaned back against the seat, his face pale, his breath uneven. You disobeyed me, he said finally, his tone quiet, almost gentle, and somehow that hurt more than if he'd shouted. I saved you, I whispered. He turned his head, his eyes finding mine, gray and fevered, but still full of that same impossible steadiness. No, he said softly. You damned yourself. Before I could answer, Before I could even understand what he meant, headlights flared behind us, too close, too fast, and the sound of engines filled the night. Luca cursed, slamming his foot down on the gas. "They're following us!" Damien tried to sit up, but pain tore through him, and I caught him before he could fall. His blood smeared across my hands again, hot and endless. "They won't stop," he murmured, his voice slurred now, fading. "They'll burn the city before they let me go." And as the car sped through the dark, as the world tilted into chaos once more, I realized with perfect, shattering clarity that this wasn't over. Not the war, not the danger, not us, because the man bleeding beside me wasn't the villain of this story. He was the consequence, and I was already too deep to ever crawl back out. The road that night felt endless, stretching like a scar across the city, the headlights slicing through sheets of rain that looked more like falling glass than water. And I remember thinking that maybe this was what purgatory felt like, suspended between survival and surrender, between what you've already lost and what you haven't yet found the strength to let go of. Damien lay slumped beside me in the back seat, his shirt soaked through with blood and sweat, his breathing shallow but steady. And even then, even half-conscious, he had the kind of presence that bent the air around him, that impossible gravity of a man who refused to die on anyone else's terms. Luca drove like a man possessed, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the tires skidding against the rain-slick asphalt as gunfire echoed in the distance. Faint now, fading, until at last it was gone, swallowed by the storm. For a moment the world was just the sound of the engine, the rain, and the fractured rhythm of Damien's breath. We made it to a safe house an hour outside the city, a place buried deep in the woods, invisible from the road, its existence whispered about, even among Damien's own men, like a myth. Luca killed the lights, parked behind a thicket of trees, and helped me drag Damien inside. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight, the air smelled of dust and pine, and somewhere beyond the broken windows, thunder rolled like a promise waiting to be kept. We laid him on the couch, his skin pale and slick, his pulse weak beneath my fingers, but there, still there. And I clung to that fragile, stubborn heartbeat like it was the only truth left in the world. "Hold on," I whispered, pressing a towel to his wound, though my hands were shaking too hard to do much good. "Please, Damien, don't you dare leave me now." He stirred then, his lips parting, his eyes fluttering open, gray and unfocused at first, then sharpening, finding me. Even in the half-light, even bleeding, he looked impossibly composed, like the chaos couldn't quite reach him, like it existed for everyone else but him. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice raw, a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." He exhaled slowly, the sound breaking halfway through. "You should have run." "Maybe I should have," I said, the words trembling. "But I didn't. And I won't." He closed his eyes again, and for a heartbeat I thought he was gone. But then he spoke, barely a whisper now. "You have no idea what it costs, Lena. To stay. To keep choosing this." I leaned closer, my hands still pressed to his chest. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what it costs." He opened his eyes, and for the first time since I'd met him, the mask slipped completely. Gone was the calm, the control, the polished cruelty he wore like armor. What was left was the man underneath. Flawed, furious, fragile. "Everything," he said simply. The hours that followed were a blur of waiting, of listening to the rain batter the roof, of trying not to count the seconds between his breaths. Luca stitched the wound with the kind of grim focus that only comes from having done it too many times before. And when it was done, he stood, wiped his hands, and looked at me with something almost like pity. "He'll live," he said, "but he won't be the same. Neither would I." When Luca left to make contact with what was left of Damien's network, I stayed beside him, unable to move, unable to think beyond the fact that he was still warm, still breathing. His hand found mine sometime before dawn, his fingers curling weakly around my wrist, his thumb brushing against my pulse like he was checking to see if I was still real. "I should have never pulled you into this," he said when he finally spoke again, his voice low, thick with exhaustion. "You were supposed to escape, not sink." I shook my head, tears burning behind my eyes. "You didn't pull me in, Damien. I walked in. You just didn't close the door fast enough." He laughed then, a soft, broken sound. And for a moment it was like nothing outside that room existed. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, trembling light that seeped through the cracks in the shutters. I stood by the window, watching the mist rise from the ground, my reflection faint in the glass. A stranger's face, hollowed by fear and something that looked dangerously close to peace. When I turned back, Damien was sitting upright, pale but awake, his gaze fixed on me. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Now I rebuild," he said, "or burn everything down trying." "And me?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You go back to your life, Lena. You disappear. You find something clean." The words should have sounded like freedom, but they felt like exile. "You think I can go back after this? After you?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between us said everything. I crossed the room slowly, every step heavy with the weight of the choice I already knew I was going to make. "You told me once that safety looks different in your world," I said, "that sometimes it bleeds." He met my gaze, and for the first time he didn't try to protect me from it. "It always does." "Then maybe that's the only kind of safety I want," I whispered. He looked at me for a long time, something fierce and fragile flickering behind his eyes. And when he finally reached for me, it wasn't with the desperation of a man trying to claim something, but with the quiet inevitability of one who had finally accepted what was already his. His hand slid to the back of my neck, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the fragile space between us. "If you stay," he said softly, "you'll never be free again." I smiled, a small, sad smile. Maybe freedom was overrated. He kissed me then, not gently, not sweetly, but like confession, like war, like two people drowning in the same ocean and choosing not to swim for shore. It wasn't salvation, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was something else, darker, deeper, truer. When he pulled away, the light had shifted, spilling across his face in fractured gold. He looked different in it. Not the devil everyone feared, not the man who commanded empires, but the man who had learned how to love in the middle of ruin. "You were never supposed to be part of this story," he said, voice trembling. "You were supposed to be the reason I left it." "Maybe I still am," I said. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like storm. Somewhere in the distance, the city was waking, unaware, uncaring, while the world we'd built in blood and fire began to reshape itself in silence. I knew then that the line between love and destruction was thinner than I'd ever imagined, and that maybe they were never opposites at all, just two sides of the same flame. When I looked at him, Damien Russo, the man I should have feared, the man I'd fallen into like gravity itself, I realized that every choice I'd made since the night I grabbed that stranger's hand had led me here, to this quiet reckoning at the edge of everything I thought I knew. He reached for me again, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure?" I nodded once. "I'm done running." And as his hand closed around mine, warm, strong, certain, I understood that some stories don't end with redemption or ruin, but with surrender. Not the kind that means defeat, but the kind that means peace. Because in a world built on betrayal and blood, Sometimes the only way to survive is to stop pretending you weren't meant to belong to the darkness. And I had chosen mine.